The moment Alice Hale slammed both palms down on the counter of Barlow's general store, every soul in the room went quiet. The flour dust hanging in the afternoon air seemed to freeze. 3 men by the pickle barrel turned slowly. The woman behind her stopped fanning herself. And old Randall Barlow, who had run this store since before the war, looked at Alice with something she could only describe as terror dressed up as pity. "Who is he?" Alice demanded, her voice low and shaking with the kind of fury that comes not from anger but from accumulated betrayal. "Who lives up on that ridge?" "Because I have asked every person in this valley one simple question, and not one of you has had the decency to answer me with actual words. You all just look up at that ridge like the answer is written in the pine trees. My sister is missing. My sister has been missing for 11 days. And every question I ask gets answered with a glance at some ridge I cannot find on any map you people will show me." Randall's jaw worked like he was chewing on something he wished he had never swallowed. "Ma'am," he said very carefully. "Do not ma'am me," Alice said. "Do not ma'am me and look up at that ridge. Tell me his name. Tell me what he knows. Tell me why half this valley goes pale at the mention of my sister Clara, and the other half acts like she never existed at all." The store was silent except for the creak of the building settling in the afternoon heat. Outside, a horse shifted against the hitching post. Somewhere down the main street of Cutter's Creek, New Mexico territory, a door slammed. And Randall Barlow in the end did what everyone else had done. He looked toward the window, toward the north, toward the ridge. Alice straightened up, picked up the small traveling bag she had carried from the stage, and walked out into the blinding July sun of 1882. She had arrived in Cutter's Creek 4 days ago, having ridden the Santa Fe Railway to Albuquerque, and then taken 2 separate stage coaches across terrain so punishing it had bruised her from the hips down. She had come because Clara's letters had stopped. Clara, who wrote every single week without fail, who had written faithfully since leaving St. Louis 2 years prior to marry a man named Douglas Holt and make a life in the New Mexico territory, had gone silent in May. The last letter Alice received had been postmarked the 8th of May, and it had contained one sentence that did not fit the cheerful tone of everything surrounding it. One sentence that Alice had read 17 times on the train west and could now recite in her sleep. The sentence read, "There is a man on the ridge who knows things about this valley that would make your blood run cold, and I have made the mistake of asking him questions." That was all. No further explanation. Just that sentence nested between a description of the wildflowers coming in and a note about a new bread recipe Clara had learned from a Pueblo woman she had befriended. Clara had vanished from her homestead on the 21st of May. Douglas Holt, her husband, had reported her missing to the county sheriff, a man named Aldous Crane, who had done approximately nothing. Douglas himself was a quiet man who seemed more bewildered than grief-stricken, which Alice found troubling in its own right. The homestead was intact. Nothing was stolen. Clara's horse was still in the paddock. She had simply not come home from an afternoon walk, and every person in this valley answered questions about her with a look toward the ridge. Alice stood in the street and stared north. The ridge was real enough. She could see it from anywhere in the valley, a dark line of elevated terrain that ran along the northern boundary of the Cutter's Creek Basin, covered in juniper and ponderosa pine that grew darker and thicker toward the summit. It was maybe 4 miles from the main street, possibly 5. She could see no structure from where she stood, but she had been told, obliquely, in the way people told her things here, that someone lived up there. Someone who had been in this valley longer than the town itself. She was going up there tomorrow at first light. That was the decision she made in the street with the July sun burning the back of her neck and the weight of 11 days of her sister's absence pressing down on her like a stone. She was done asking questions that got answered with silence and glances. She was going up that ridge, and she was going to knock on whatever door she found, and she was going to get answers. What she did not expect, could not have anticipated, was that the answers would destroy everything she thought she understood about this valley, and that the person who finally told her the truth would become the center of her entire world before summer's end. She had been in Cutter's Creek 4 days, as has been said, and those 4 days had established a very specific and very maddening pattern. The town was not large. Its main street held a general store, a bank, a land office, a livery stable, a saloon called the Red Bird, a physician's office, a small hotel called the Meridian House where Alice had taken a room, and a church that held services on Sunday mornings. The population of the surrounding valley, including the ranches and homesteads and the small number of Apache families who had managed to hold onto land in the area despite the ongoing and unjust pressure of territorial expansion, was perhaps 300 souls in total. Of those 300 souls, Alice had spoken to approximately 40. She had spoken to the sheriff, to the hotel proprietor, to Randall Barlow, to Douglas Holt twice, to the physician-doctor, Emmett Faraday, to 3 women she had met at the church who had known Clara socially, to 2 cowhands from a ranch south of town, to a Mexican family who ran a laundry operation near the livery, and to a Jicarilla Apache man named Thomas who had come to town to trade and who had listened to Alice with great attention before saying, very quietly, that she should be careful what she stirred up in this valley, because there were things buried here that not everyone wanted unearthed. She had also spoken to the bartender at the Red Bird, who had gone pale at the mention of her sister's name and then pretended he had never heard it before, which was such a transparent lie that Alice had felt almost insulted. Every single one of them, without exception, had looked toward the north at some point during the conversation. Some did it deliberately, as if directing her. Others did it unconsciously, a reflexive twitch of the eyes toward the high ground. But it was consistent and it was universal, and it told Alice 2 things with absolute certainty. There was a secret in this valley, and that secret lived on the ridge. She went to bed that night in her room at the Meridian House with her traveling bag packed and her boots set beside the door. She lay on top of the thin cotton blanket and listened to the sounds of the desert night coming through the single window, the dry wind, the distant sound of coyotes, the faint music from the Red Bird 3 buildings down. She thought about Clara. She thought about that sentence in the letter. She thought about the look on Randall Barlow's face when she had slammed her hands on his counter. She thought about the ridge. She did not sleep much. Before the sky had fully committed to dawn, Alice was dressed, had her bag over one shoulder and was making her way to the livery to hire a horse. The liveryman, a young man named Pete who could not have been more than 20, looked at her and then looked north without her even saying a word. "I need a reliable horse and directions to the ridge," Alice said. "Not a glance, actual directions." Pete scratched the back of his neck. He was fighting with himself visibly. She could see it happening, some internal argument between what he had been told and what he could see standing in front of him, which was a woman from St. Louis in a dark traveling dress with dust on her boots and determination in her eyes that suggested she would walk to the ridge barefoot if she had to. "Straight north on the old wagon road," Pete said finally, very quietly as if confessing to something. "Follow it till the road forks. Take the left fork. It gets steep after a mile. There is a gate across the path. Big iron gate with an M worked into it. Do not go past the gate without announcing yourself." He does not like people who do not announce themselves. "And his name?" Alice asked. Pete looked at her for a long moment. "Wesley Mercer," he said. "His name is Wesley Mercer, and ma'am, I mean this kindly, he is not an easy man to know. But he is not a bad one. Whatever they have been telling you or not telling you, he is not bad." Alice thanked him and paid for the horse, a sturdy bay mare that Pete saddled quickly and without conversation. She rode out of Cutter's Creek in the gray pre-dawn light with the mountains still a dark suggestion to the east and the valley floor pale and cool around her. The wagon road Pete had described was easy to find, a double track worn into the earth heading north, and she followed it through stands of desert scrub and across a dry creek bed before the terrain began to rise and the vegetation changed, the scrub giving way to juniper, the juniper giving way to pin-on-pine, the pin-on-pine giving way to the taller and denser ponderosa that clothed the upper ridge in darkness. She found the gate exactly where Pete had described it. Iron-heavy, set between two thick timber posts, and worked into the iron with a skill that surprised her was a large letter M made of twisted metal that had been worked until it looked almost like a brand burned into the air itself. The gate was closed but not locked, she discovered when she got close enough to examine it. There was no padlock, only a simple latch. Alice unlatched the gate, led her horse through, latched it again behind her, and remounted. The path on the other side of the gate was narrow but clear, obviously maintained. Someone kept the worst of the brush cut back and had laid flat stones across two places where the path crossed small spring-fed trickles. The trees pressed close on both sides and the air was cooler up here, significantly cooler, with the smell of pine resin and something she could not identify, something mineral and clean like rain on stone. She heard him before she saw him. Not his voice, his work. The sound of an axe striking wood with a rhythmic precision that suggested someone who had been splitting wood for so long the action had become unconscious, automatic, as natural as breathing. 3 strikes, a pause, 3 strikes, a pause. She followed that sound around a bend in the path and into a clearing that opened up with a suddenness that took her breath away. The cabin was large, larger than she expected, built from logs that had been hewn and fitted with care, the gaps chinked white. There was a real porch across the front with 2 chairs on it, and a stone chimney at each end of the building. There was a barn to the left, solid and well constructed. There was a kitchen garden behind a low fence to the right, and even from the path she could see it was meticulously kept, organized rows of what looked like beans, squash, some kind of leafy greens she did not recognize. There were chickens in a wire enclosure near the barn. There was a water pump with a stone surround. There was a windbreak of planted trees to the northwest, deliberate and established. Someone had planted those trees years ago knowing exactly what they were for. And there, at a splitting stump 20 feet from the porch, was Wesley Mercer. He was perhaps 30 years of age, possibly 32 or 33. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing work trousers and a collarless shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows. His hair was dark and needed cutting. He had not shaved in several days. He was lifting a round of pine onto the stump with one hand, setting it, and splitting it with an axe that he swung with a compact efficiency that spoke of years of practice, not performance. He heard the horse before he turned. She saw his shoulders change when he heard her, a subtle shift, a heightening of attention, and then he turned, the axe held loosely at his side, and looked at her. His eyes were gray, pale gray, like the sky just before a storm decided what it was going to do. He looked at her with an expression she could not read, not hostile, not welcoming, not surprised, just attentive, measuring. "You have come a long way for a conversation," he said. His voice was low and carried the faint, almost worn-away remnant of an accent she could not place. Not Western. Something older, more Eastern, long since diluted by years of living somewhere that had no use for it. "My name is Alice Hale," she said. "Clara Holt is my sister. She has been missing for 11 days, and every person in this valley answers my questions by looking at your ridge. So I have come to your ridge to ask my questions directly." He held her gaze for a moment that felt very long. Then he set the axe against the splitting stump with a careful, deliberate motion and said, "Get down off that horse. I will put coffee on. This will take some time to say properly." She got down off the horse. He pointed to a rail near the pump where she could tie the mare. She tied the mare. She followed him up the porch steps and through the front door of the cabin, and she entered the life of Wesley Mercer, and nothing that came after was ever simple or safe or predictable, and she would not have changed a single moment of it. The inside of the cabin told her things about him immediately, before he said a word. It was clean, deeply clean. The kind of clean that comes from discipline rather than habit. The main room served as both sitting room and kitchen, with a large iron cookstove against the back wall and a long table of hand-planed wood in the center. There were bookshelves, 2 of them, built into the wall beside the eastern window, and they were full, not decoratively full but actually full, the books worn and read and stacked in ways that suggested frequent consultation rather than display. There was a surveyor's table in the far corner with maps on it, the maps covered in notations made in a small, precise hand. There were no decorative items except for one thing, a woman's silhouette portrait in a small oval frame on the mantel above the eastern fireplace. Alice noticed it but said nothing. Wesley Mercer moved to the cookstove with the ease of a man in his own domain, stirred the coals to life, added wood with economy, and set a blue enamel coffee pot on the back burner. He moved to the table and pulled out a chair for her with a gesture so natural and ungrudging that it surprised her. She sat. He sat across from her and looked at her steadily. "I knew Clara Holt," he said. "She is alive." The relief hit Alice so hard she had to grip the edge of the table. "Where is she?" "She is safe, and I will tell you where. But to tell you where, I have to tell you why she left. And to tell you why she left, I have to tell you what she found out. And to tell you what she found out, I have to tell you what I know about this valley. And some of what I know is dark, Miss Hale, and some of it will make you angry, and some of it will make you understand why the people down there look toward this ridge instead of answering questions. They look toward this ridge because they are afraid of what I know, and because they are not entirely wrong to be afraid of it." Alice clasped her hands together on the table and held herself very still. "Then tell me," she said. "All of it." Wesley Mercer looked at her for a moment longer, and she had the distinct impression that he was making a decision that had weight to it, a decision he had been postponing for some time, and that her presence had now made impossible to delay further. "The coffee will be ready in a few minutes," he said. "When it is ready, I will start at the beginning." He poured the coffee when it was ready, set a cup in front of her without asking how she took it, and she found she drank it black up here on this ridge without even thinking to ask for sugar, as if the altitude or the morning or the man across from her had reset some small part of her without her permission. He started at the beginning. His beginning. Wesley Mercer had come to the Cutter's Creek Valley in 1874, 8 years prior, when the valley was even more sparsely settled than it was now. He had come from Virginia originally, hence the faded remnant of the accent, though he had spent the preceding decade in Kansas and Colorado before making his way to New Mexico Territory. He had bought the ridge land from the territorial government for a price so low it had seemed almost suspicious. And he had come to understand over time that the low price was not generosity, but was instead the government's way of keeping someone who could not be easily corrupted or purchased in proximity to a situation that the government wanted watched, but did not want to officially acknowledge. The situation was this. The Cutter's Creek Valley sat atop a vein of silver ore that ran north to south through the basin, not on the surface, not obvious, but discoverable to anyone who knew geology and who spent time in the terrain. Wesley Mercer knew geology. He had learned it in Virginia before the war from a father who was an engineer, and he had refined that knowledge through 8 years of practical prospecting across Kansas and Colorado. He had identified the silver vein within his first year on the ridge. He had told no one, but other people had also identified it. Specifically, a man named Carver Dunn, who was the largest landowner in the valley and whose ranch encompassed most of the western basin, had commissioned a geological survey in 1878 that confirmed the silver. Dunn had spent the subsequent 4 years quietly and illegally acquiring or extinguishing the claims of every homesteader and small rancher whose land sat above the vein. Some he bought out fairly, many he did not. Several families had been pressured off their land through manipulation of water rights, through manufactured debt, through threats that were subtle enough to be deniable but clear enough to be effective. 3 families, Wesley said, had been run off their land by methods that crossed the line from legal intimidation into outright criminal conduct. He had watched this happen from the ridge. He had evidence of it, documented, recorded, kept in the surveyor's table in the corner. Letters he had intercepted with the help of a postal clerk in Albuquerque who owed him a debt. Survey records that had been falsified. A deed that bore a forged signature, the original of which he had managed to obtain a copy of through means he declined to specify. The sheriff, Aldous Crane, was on Dunn's payroll. The bank manager, a man named Hollis Prout, was on Dunn's payroll. Several members of the County Land Commission were on Dunn's payroll. And Clara? Alice asked, her voice controlled with an effort she could feel in her throat. Clara, Wesley explained, had come to him. Not at first. At first she had simply been curious, the way newcomers sometimes were, about the man on the ridge that everyone seemed so anxious about. She had climbed the ridge on her own last February, announced herself at the gate, and he had let her in and given her coffee, and she had asked him, point blank, why people were afraid of him. He had told her the truth, or most of it. He had told her about Dunn and the silver and the corruption. He had told her because she was direct and clearly intelligent, and he had been carrying the knowledge alone for too long, and there was something in her that invited honesty. Clara had been disturbed by what she learned. She had gone home and investigated on her own, in the careful, quiet way that intelligent women in 1882 could investigate without drawing too much direct suspicion, by asking social questions, by paying attention to conversations at church, by befriending people who were connected to Dunn's operation without being inside it. And she had found something Wesley had not known, something that changed the equation significantly. One of the families that Dunn had run off their land violently, a family named Reyes, had not simply left the valley. The father, a man named Emilio Reyes, had gone to Santa Fe to file a formal complaint with the territorial governor's office. He had documentation. He had witnesses, and he had disappeared on the road between Albuquerque and Santa Fe in March of this year, 3 months ago. His wife and children had made it to relatives in Albuquerque and were there now. Clara had determined that Emilio Reyes' disappearance was not accidental. She had found a man in Cutter's Creek, a drifter who worked occasionally for Dunn, who had been present on the road that night and who had told Clara what happened under the influence of considerable whiskey at the Red Bird. She had told Wesley, and then 11 days ago she had vanished. Dunn found out she knew, Alice said. It was not a question. I believe so, Wesley said. I believe someone told him. Not who, I do not know. I believe he had her taken, not killed, because killing a woman from St. Louis whose family knew where she was going would bring a kind of attention he does not want. He had her taken and placed somewhere she could be held quietly while he decides what to do next. Where? Wesley stood and went to his surveyor's table. He brought a map back to the table and spread it between them. His finger traced a line south and east of the valley. There is an old hacienda, he said. Abandoned in the 1860s. It is on land Dunn owns but has never developed. It is 17 miles from here. I have had it under watch for the past week, since I determined she was not in the valley itself. I had confirmation 2 days ago that there are people living in it who should not be there, and among them is a woman matching Clara's description. Alice looked at the map, then up at him. You have been watching. You have been gathering information. You have evidence in that table. Why have you not acted? Why are you sitting on this ridge while my sister sits in an abandoned hacienda? She did not say it with accusation. She said it with genuine need to understand, and he heard that distinction and answered it directly. Because if I act alone and it goes wrong, everything I have is lost and Clara's situation worsens. Because the evidence I have needs to go to someone with actual authority, not to Aldous Crane, but to the territorial marshal's office in Santa Fe. I have been in contact with the territorial marshal for 3 weeks. I am waiting for his response. I am waiting for the law to move because if I move first, I give Dunn a justification for violence that he currently does not have. 3 weeks, Alice said. Yes, Clara has been missing 11 days, I know, and you have been waiting for a letter. Yes. Alice looked at the map again. She looked at the coffee cup in her hands. She looked at the portrait on the mantel because she could not help it, because it had been there in her peripheral vision since she sat down, and she needed to understand the man she was trusting. "Who is she?" Alice asked, nodding toward the portrait. Wesley looked at the mantel. Something moved through his expression that was carefully contained but real. "My wife," he said. "Margaret. She died in 1879. Fever." "I am sorry," Alice said. "She was the one who helped me understand that the evidence needed to be handled carefully," he said. "She had a clearer head for it than I did. After she died, I continued because she would have wanted it continued. But it has been slow. Slower than it should have been." Alice was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I am going to that hacienda. Not alone." "Then come with me." He looked at her, really looked at her, the way he had been looking at her since she rode into his clearing. That measuring look that she was beginning to understand was not coldness but precision, the way a man who had been burned by trusting too quickly learned to look at the world with care before committing to it. "I have a rifle," he said, "and 2 horses." "Then we will take both horses," Alice said. That was how it began. Not with soft words or gentle discovery, but with a decision made over a cooling cup of coffee in the high, clean air of a pine ridge in the summer of 1882. Two people whose lives had been shaped by loss and persistence choosing to move together toward something dangerous, because neither of them could see another option that allowed them to live with themselves. They left within the hour. Wesley packed a canvas bag with supplies, checked a Winchester rifle that he handled with the practiced ease of someone who had used one extensively but without pleasure, and saddled his own horse, a tall gray gelding that matched his eyes in a way Alice noticed, and then told herself was a ridiculous thing to notice under the circumstances. They rode south and east. Wesley knew the terrain with the intimacy of 8 years, and he took them along routes that kept them off the main roads, through arroyos and across open grassland that offered long sight lines, so that anyone watching would be visible long before they became a threat. He rode with his eyes moving constantly, not anxious, just alert, the way a man moves through country he knows is contested. He talked as they rode, not about the case or the plan, but about the valley itself. He told her the names of the plants they passed, the uses the local Apache people had for them. He told her about the geology of the terrain, how the land had formed, what the different layers of rock meant about the valley's history. He did it naturally, without performance, and Alice realized after a mile or two that he was doing it because he was genuinely interested in these things, and because talking about them was as natural to him as breathing, and that somewhere in the 8 years he had spent largely alone on the ridge he had accumulated a vast and specific knowledge of the living world around him that he rarely got to share. She found herself asking questions. Real questions, interested questions, not the interrogative questions she had been asking all week. She asked about the silver vein and whether he had ever mined any of it himself. He said no, that the silver was not his to mine, that it sat under land that belonged to people Dunn had driven off, and that profiting from it felt wrong in the same way that stealing did. She asked about the Apache families in the valley and what their situation was. His jaw tightened in a way that told her this was something that genuinely angered him, and he explained that the Jicarilla Apache people in this region had been subjected to the same dispossession as the settler families, but with the additional injustice of having the law itself structured against them, and that Dunn had used territorial land policy as a weapon against them, the same way he had used it against the Ray's family and others. Wesley had, he said carefully, helped 2 Apache families document their land use in ways that might be useful if the territorial government ever moved toward actual fairness, which he acknowledged was a large if. "You have been doing a great deal up on that ridge," Alice said. "Not enough," he said, and she heard in those 2 words the particular weight of a person who measures themselves against what they should have been able to do and finds the gap between the real and the ideal impossible to fully close. They reached the hacienda as the afternoon sun was beginning its long slide toward the horizon. They came at it from the high ground to the northeast, approaching through a stand of cottonwood trees that grew along a dry streambed and provided cover to within 200 yards of the structure. Wesley stopped them there and they watched. The hacienda was large, the old kind, built in the Spanish colonial style from adobe that had been crumbling for 20 years, the once grand walls now patched and improvised. There was smoke from one interior chimney. There were 2 horses in the paddock. There was a man sitting on the south wall of the outer courtyard with a rifle across his knees. 1 guard, possibly more inside. Alice looked at the building and thought about Clara inside it and felt the tight, controlled anger that had been her companion for 11 days flare into something sharper. "I am going to the front gate," she said. "You are not. Listen to me. 1 armed man on the wall, possibly 1 or 2 inside. If I ride up to the front gate and say I'm a traveler who has lost my way, his attention goes forward. Your attention goes from the side." Wesley was quiet for a moment. "And if there are more than 2 inside, then we reassess. But a woman alone asking for directions is not a threat that anyone in 1882 expects to manage carefully." He looked at her with that gray-eyed precision, and she held the look steadily and did not flinch. "Do not do anything reckless," he said. "I rarely do," she said, which was not entirely true but felt true in this moment. She rode out of the cottonwoods and toward the hacienda at a steady, unhurried pace, holding herself upright in the saddle with the posture of a woman who has every right to be wherever she is. The guard on the wall saw her when she was still 100 yards out and stood, then settled again as she approached without apparent urgency. She stopped at the gate and looked up at him with what she hoped was a convincingly confused expression. "Excuse me," she called. "I am afraid I have taken a wrong turn. I am trying to reach the Cutter's Creek Road. Can you tell me which direction?" The guard was a young man, maybe 25, weathered but not particularly intelligent-looking, and he leaned on the wall and looked at her with the mild suspicion of someone who was guarding something but had not been told to be especially worried. "Road is north," he said. "You have come well south." "Thank you," Alice said. She shifted the horse slightly to keep his eyes on her. "Is there perhaps some water I might give my horse? She has had a hard ride." He was weighing that. She could see him weighing it. There was a moment, just a moment, where she thought he would say no, and she would have to think of something else. And then she heard a sound from the far side of the hacienda that was not dramatic but was absolutely deliberate. A single sharp noise like a stone thrown against an outer wall, and the guard turned his head toward it. And in that moment she heard the side gate being opened, and she said, loudly enough to cover the sound, "What a beautiful countryside this is. I have never seen New Mexico before. It is so much grander than I imagined." She kept talking, cheerful, inconsequential, while sounds she was not supposed to be the source of came from the other side of the building. She talked about the train from St. Louis and the altitude and the quality of the roads. The guard turned back to her twice, half listening, and she smiled and talked and waited. And then Wesley was at the outer gate with a hand signal she understood to mean come now. She wheeled the mare and rode around the building without looking back at the guard. By the time the guard understood what had happened, Alice was through the side gate and into the courtyard, and Wesley was there with a second person beside him. Clara. Clara was thinner than Alice remembered, and her dress was dirty, and there were shadows under her eyes that spoke of 11 days of poor sleep and genuine fear. But she was on her feet and her eyes were clear. And when she saw Alice, she made a sound that was not a word, just a sound. And then they were holding each other with the fierce grip of 2 people who had been genuinely afraid of what they might lose. "We need to move," Wesley said quietly, and his voice was gentle but the urgency in it was real. They moved. The guard on the wall had come down from his position and was running around the outer perimeter and shouting for someone. And the someone inside the hacienda was answering, and there were footsteps, and there was the very real possibility that this was about to become something more complicated than a quiet retrieval. Wesley got Clara onto his gray gelding and himself behind her, and Alice rode the bay mare, and they went northeast toward the cottonwoods at a hard gallop that ate the 200 yards of open ground in less time than it takes to draw a full breath. The cottonwoods swallowed them. Wesley guided them through the dry stream bed and east along it for half a mile before turning north, putting terrain between themselves and the hacienda with a systematic efficiency that spoke of someone who had thought carefully about exit routes before they came. They rode for an hour before Wesley slowed them to a walk, and they were high enough in the terrain and far enough from the hacienda that pursuit was unlikely. Clara had been silent through all of it, holding onto the saddle with both hands, but now she turned her head and looked at Alice riding beside them and said, "You came." "Of course I came," Alice said. "I was afraid they would not let you know. I was afraid Douglas would not write." "He wrote," Alice said, which was only partially true. Douglas had written to their parents, who had written to Alice. The chain of communication had been slow and fragmented, and Alice had come west on incomplete information, but she was here and Clara was on a horse, and that was sufficient for this moment. Clara looked at Wesley. "You found her." "She found me," Wesley said. "She came up the ridge herself." Clara made a short sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob and was probably some of both. "Of course she did," she said. They reached the ridge cabin after dark. Wesley lit the lamps and put more wood in the cook stove and found food, beans and salt pork and cornbread he made from scratch with a speed and competence that Alice found herself watching despite herself. Clara ate 3 portions and told them everything. She had been held in the hacienda for 11 days by 2 men who worked for Dunn, not mistreated physically, but kept in a back room, and told she would be released when Dunn decided what to do with her. She had overheard conversations she was not meant to hear. The drifter she had spoken to at the Red Bird, the one who told her about Emilio Reyes on the road to Santa Fe, had told Dunn about the conversation the following day. Dunn had arranged for Clara to be taken before she could pass the information to anyone official. "He knows about you," Clara told Wesley. "He knows you have evidence. He has known for a while. He has not moved against you directly because he is afraid of what you have sent copies of to people in Santa Fe." "I have sent copies to the Territorial Marshal's office," Wesley confirmed, "and to a newspaper in Albuquerque, and to a lawyer I know in Santa Fe who handles land disputes." "He thinks you have sent more than that," Clara said. "He is more afraid than he acts. That is what I heard him say to one of the men." Wesley was quiet, processing this. Alice watched him think. She could see the mechanism of it, the systematic way he assembled information and tested it against what he already knew, and she felt a strange admiration for it, an admiration that was mixed up with something else she was not ready to examine directly. "He will move against the cabin next," Alice said. "Probably," Wesley agreed. "Then we need to go to Cutter's Creek tomorrow and send a telegraph to Santa Fe." "I have sent telegraphs." "From Cutter's Creek?" "Through a telegraph office that Dunn has access to." Wesley went still. Then, "No, I have sent letters. I have not used the telegraph." "Then we need to send one from somewhere he cannot intercept it." "Where is the nearest telegraph office outside his influence?" Wesley looked at the map. "Alamosa Junction, 20 miles east." "Then tomorrow we send a telegraph from Alamosa Junction," Alice said. Clara was asleep in the chair by the fire. She had fallen asleep mid-sentence, the exhaustion of 11 days catching her at once. Wesley found a blanket and covered her with it, moving quietly, and then stood looking at his small cabin with 2 women in it and an expression that was difficult to parse. "You can have the bed," he said to Alice. "I will sleep out here. I will not displace you. You will not displace me. This is my house and I will sleep where I choose, which tonight is on that bench with a blanket because I need to be between the door and my guests." She looked at him for a moment. "Are you expecting trouble tonight?" "I am not expecting it," he said, "but I am not ruling it out." She went to the bed, which was in a separate room behind a plank door, and she lay in it with her boots off and her dress still on, and she looked at the plank ceiling and listened to the sounds of the ridge, the wind in the pines, the distant calling of something in the dark, and she thought about Wesley Mercer sitting on a bench between a door and 2 women because that was the right thing to do. and she thought about the evidence in his surveyor's table and the 8 years of careful, patient, solitary work. And the portrait of Margaret on the mantel, and she felt something opening in her chest that she had not felt in a very long time. She was 26 years old. She had been engaged once, briefly, at 22, to a man in St. Louis who had seemed steady and turned out to be hollow. Since then she had taught school, which she loved, and read everything she could find, which she also loved, and had told herself that she was complete, that she did not need what other women seemed to need, and she had believed it with the conviction that comes from having decided something very firmly and not tested the decision. She was beginning to suspect that decisions made firmly in the abstract sometimes met the world and found themselves insufficient. She slept. In the morning, Wesley made coffee and eggs, and they ate quickly, and he rode with both women down from the ridge to Cutter's Creek, arriving in the early morning while the town was still at its morning pace. He left them at the Meridian house with specific instructions: stay inside, speak to no one about where they had been, and be ready to leave again within 2 hours. He went to see Randall Barlow. Alice watched from the window of her hotel room and saw him walk into the general store and come out 12 minutes later with a different expression, one that was less contained than his usual bearing. She saw him stand in the street for a moment and look north toward his ridge, and she understood that he was seeing his home from the valley's perspective, seeing the view they all had of it, and she wondered what that felt like. He came back to the hotel and knocked. She opened the door. "Barlow confirmed that Dunn is in town," Wesley said. "He came in last night. He is at the Red Bird, and he is looking for information about a woman who visited his property yesterday afternoon. He does not know it was me specifically. Not yet, but he will make inquiries, and he will find out from Pete at the livery that a woman from the Meridian house hired a horse and rode north." "Then we leave for Alamosa Junction now," Alice said. "Yes," he said. "Yes, we do." They left through the back of the hotel, which had an alley exit onto a side street that avoided the main road. Wesley had 3 horses ready, having retrieved Clara's horse from the livery through an arrangement he had made with Pete that involved a note passed through the hotel laundry. Pete, it seemed, was willing to be quietly helpful when given a framework that did not require him to openly defy anyone powerful. They made Alamosa Junction in under 3 hours, riding at a pace that was urgent without being reckless. The junction was a small settlement that existed primarily because of the rail line and the telegraph cable, and the telegraph office was staffed by a young man named Chester, who seemed almost ecstatically grateful to have something interesting to handle. Wesley composed the message with care, standing at the counter with a pencil and a piece of paper, crossing out words and replacing them until he had something dense and specific and complete. It contained names, dates, the location of the hacienda, the name of Emilio Reyes and the nature of his disappearance, and a direct request for a territorial marshal to be sent to Cutter's Creek within 48 hours. He addressed it to the office of the territorial marshal and to the Albuquerque newspaper editor he had been corresponding with separately. Chester sent it while they waited. Alice watched Wesley's face as the message went out on the wire, and she saw something in it release, some small portion of the long tension he had been carrying, and it made him look briefly younger, less iron-fortified, more like the man he might have been before 8 years of solitary watching had built all those walls around him. "It is done," Chester said. They rode back to Cutter's Creek, arriving in the mid-afternoon. They went directly to the sheriff's office, not to Aldous Crane, who they correctly assumed was useless, but to use the office's public record room, which Wesley wanted to access with Alice as witness, to pull and document 3 specific deed records that he had not yet had independent copies of. Crane was at his desk and looked up at all 3 of them with the look of a man who has been anticipating a problem he hoped would resolve itself without his involvement, and has now been denied that hope. "Wesley," he said carefully. "Aldous," Wesley replied equally carefully. "I need to access the public record room. That is my right under territorial statute." And these women, my guests, they are witnesses. Crane looked at them. He looked at Clara with a particular quality of alarm that told Alice he knew exactly who Clara was and had been aware that she was missing and had done precisely nothing about it. Your guests, Crane repeated. My guests, Wesley said in a tone that closed the conversation. Crane let them through. The records were found and documented. Wesley had paper and pencil and copied the relevant portions in his small, precise hand, while Alice held the documents and Clara watched the door. They were leaving the sheriff's office when Carver Dunn walked in. Alice had formed a mental image of Dunn from everything she had heard, and the image was partly accurate and partly wrong. She had imagined someone larger, more overtly threatening. What she got was a man of perhaps 55, medium height, well-dressed for a ranch in 1882, with the kind of controlled, expensive manner that comes from spending decades making other people afraid of you without ever having to do anything crude yourself. He had cold blue eyes and a short gray beard, and he wore a suit that cost more than most men in this valley made in a month. He stopped when he saw them. He saw Clara first, and his expression did not change except in the eyes, and what went through the eyes was calculation rather than emotion, a rapid reassessment, a man who has lost a piece from his board and is determining what that means for the rest of the game. Then he looked at Wesley. Mercer, he said. Dunn, Wesley said. He said it with absolute steadiness, and Alice found herself standing very still because the air between these two men had a quality to it that was not heat exactly but was related to heat, the quality of two forces that have been aware of each other from a distance for a long time and are now finally in the same room. You have been busy, Dunn said. I have been doing what needs doing, Wesley said. Mrs. Holt, Dunn said, addressing Clara with a tone so civil it was almost an insult. I hope you are recovered from your indisposition. I was not indisposed, Clara said, with a steadiness that made Alice quietly proud. I was imprisoned on your property by your men. That is a different thing. Something moved across Dunn's face that was the closest thing to anger Alice saw from him in that entire encounter. It was brief and it was controlled and it disappeared quickly, but it was there. I do not know what you think you are going to accomplish, Dunn said to Wesley. I have sent a telegraph to the territorial marshal, Wesley said. The Albuquerque Press. You will have visitors by day after tomorrow. I would suggest you spend the time between now and then reviewing how you want to explain the Reyes family situation, and the Harmon families, and the Ortega families, and the deed to the Northern Water Rights which bears Emilio Reyes' signature in a hand that is not his own. Dunn was silent for a moment. Then he said very quietly, You have made a serious mistake. I have made the only correct decision, Wesley said. I should have made it sooner. I am sorry I did not. He ushered Clara and Alice out of the sheriff's office and into the street, and they walked together quickly to the hotel. In the room, Clara sat on the bed and let out a long, trembling breath. Is he going to send men tonight? She asked. He might, Wesley said. He looked at the window and then at the door. I want you both to pack what you need and come back to the ridge. It is the safest place until the marshal arrives. He knows every inch of the valley, but he does not know the ridge the way I do, and he is less likely to do something overt up there than he is in town. They packed. They rode back to the ridge in the late afternoon light that turned the valley gold, and the mountains purple, and the sky above it, all an extraordinary deep blue that Alice had never seen in any sky over Missouri. She rode with Wesley slightly ahead of Clara, and they were quiet together, a quiet that was not uncomfortable but was instead the kind that exists between people who have shared something significant and are still processing what it means. You have been very brave today, he said at one point, not looking at her, watching the trail ahead. I have been practical, she said. Those are sometimes the same thing, he said. She looked at his profile, the line of jaw and the dark hair, and the way he sat the gray gelding with an ease that was so natural it seemed like an extension of himself rather than a skill. She looked away. Why did you wait so long? She asked. With the evidence. You said yourself you should have moved sooner." He was quiet for a moment that was long enough to tell her the answer was not simple. "After Margaret died," he said, "I stopped trusting my own judgment about what was urgent. I kept telling myself that one more piece of evidence, one more documented instance would make the case unassailable. But the truth is that I was also afraid, not of done, of being wrong, of moving and causing something to go wrong and having it be my fault." He paused. "She would have told me I was being excessively cautious. She was usually right about those things." Alice considered that. "She sounds like she was remarkable." "She was," he said simply. "She left a very large absence." They were at the gate. He got down and opened it and they rode through. Alice latched it behind them. The next day and a half on the ridge were, in Alice's subsequent memory of that summer, among the strangest and most vivid of her life. Strange because the circumstances were objectively serious and tense, with the knowledge of done in the valley below and the uncertain wait for the marshal's response. Vivid because of what filled the hours between the serious and tense moments, which was conversation. She and Wesley talked. They talked for hours, through a long evening and into the night while Clara slept and the fire burned and the pine trees moved in the wind outside. They talked about Virginia and St. Louis and the respective worlds they had come from and left, consciously or not. They talked about books, specifically, and found that they had read several of the same ones and had opinions about them that were sometimes compatible and sometimes delightfully contradictory and always interesting. He had opinions about Darwin that she challenged with opinions of her own. She had opinions about Mary Shelley that he had never considered and found worth considering once she articulated them. He told her about the night in 1876 when a meteorite had come down in the valley, visible from the ridge, a streak of fire that had lasted nearly 4 seconds, and how he had climbed down the next morning and found the impact site and spent 3 hours looking at the crater and the fused earth and thinking about distances that made the distances he had traveled in his life seem negligible. She told him about the school she taught in St. Louis and about a particular student, a girl of 12 who had been told consistently that she was not intelligent and who had turned out to be the most gifted student Alice had ever taught, and about the letter she had received from that girl's mother 3 years later saying the girl had been admitted to a ladies' college and that Alice's work with her had made it possible. She told him things she had not told many people. He listened with a completeness that she had not encountered often, the kind of listening where a person is genuinely receiving what you say rather than waiting for their turn to speak. And in the morning, over coffee, she realized that she was happy. Not in spite of the circumstances, but alongside them, separately from them, a happiness that existed in its own space and was not contingent on the danger being resolved. She was happy sitting across the rough plain table from Wesley Mercer with coffee in her hand and pine light coming through the window. The marshal came on the second morning. He came with 2 deputies, and he came up the ridge road because Barlow, who had apparently decided that his conscience had reached its limit, had told the marshal where to find Wesley Mercer. The marshal was a man named Joaquin Flores, 38 years old, thorough and unimpressed by either money or pretension, and he sat at Wesley's table and went through the evidence in the surveyor's table for 3 hours with the focused patience of a man who had been waiting for exactly this kind of case to arrive on his desk. He arrested Carver Dunn that afternoon. He arrested the sheriff Aldous Crane 2 hours later. He arrested the bank manager Hollis Prout the following morning. The Territorial Land Commission sent investigators within a week. The Albuquerque newspaper ran the story on the front page, and it was picked up in Santa Fe and Tucson, and eventually in St. Louis and Washington. It was not a quick process. The legal machinery of 1882 in the New Mexico Territory moved at its own pace, which was not fast, but it moved, and the evidence Wesley had accumulated across 8 years was, as he had always intended, unassailable. The Reyes family's land was ultimately returned to them through a territorial court ruling in October. The other displaced families received compensation settlements that were inadequate but acknowledged. The Apache families who had been subjected to Dunn's pressure received a formal acknowledgement from the territorial government that was also inadequate but was more than had existed before. Emilio Reyes's disappearance was investigated, and while a definitive legal conclusion proved difficult to reach, the evidence surrounding it was documented and preserved, and the man most directly responsible for it left the territory quietly and never returned. These were not perfect outcomes. Alice understood that. Wesley understood it better, having watched this valley for 8 years, knowing exactly the distance between what the law could do and what justice actually required. The silver vein remained in the earth, and the territorial government eventually developed it through a process that was complicated and contested, and did not fully compensate the people whose land it ran beneath. The injustices against the Apache people in the valley were acknowledged, and then, in the subsequent years, not sufficiently addressed, which was consistent with every other injustice against indigenous people in the territory and the nation, and Wesley never let himself stop being angry about that, and Alice loved him for it. But that is getting ahead of the story. In the days immediately after the marshal's arrival, while the legal proceedings were beginning their slow machinery, Alice and Clara stayed on the ridge. Clara because it was safer, and because she needed the rest, and because Douglas Holt had ridden up on the second day looking genuinely shattered by what he had learned and what he had failed to notice, and had spent an hour on the porch with Clara in a conversation Alice deliberately did not listen to. Whatever was said in that conversation, Clara came inside afterward looking not reconciled exactly, but thoughtful, and said that Douglas was a good man who had been blinkered by his own concerns, but that she believed he was genuinely sorry and that she wanted to give her marriage a fair consideration. Alice stayed on the ridge because she was not ready to leave it. She told herself this was because the situation was still developing. She told herself this because she was waiting to be sure Clara was safe. She told herself this for about 4 days, and then she stopped telling herself things and just stayed, which was more honest. She found herself being useful in concrete ways. She organized the documentation that the marshal's deputies needed in a chronological fashion that made it significantly easier to present. She wrote letters on Wesley's behalf to the lawyer in Santa Fe and to the newspaper editor, because her writing was clearer than his in the formal sense, which he acknowledged without self-deprecation as simply true, and because she could argue a case on paper with the precision of someone who had spent years explaining complicated things to children in ways that made sense. She helped in the garden because the beans needed attention, and she was constitutionally incapable of watching something that needed doing go undone. She cooked, which she did adequately rather than brilliantly, and he cooked, which he did brilliantly rather than adequately, and they arrived at a comfortable domestic rhythm in that kitchen that neither of them mentioned directly, because mentioning it directly would have required acknowledging what it meant. It was Clara who said it, because Clara was direct in the way that only people who have recently been imprisoned against their will can be direct. She said it to Alice on a morning when Wesley had ridden down to meet with the marshal, and the two sisters were alone on the ridge. "You are in love with him," Clara said over the breakfast table, with the tone of someone reporting a straightforward observation rather than making a declaration. Alice looked at her coffee cup. "That is a strong characterization." "You lit up when he came in this morning," Clara said. "You have been lighting up when he comes into a room for a week. You also have opinions about his opinions, and you have clearly been thinking very carefully about how to express those opinions in a way that he will find interesting rather than simply contrary, which is not something you do with people you are indifferent to." "I always think carefully about how to express my opinions," Alice said. "Not the same way," Clara said. "Not with that particular quality of care. Alice, I know you." Alice was quiet. Outside, the morning wind was moving through the pines and the chickens were making their particular sounds, and somewhere on the far side of the barn, a magpie was involved in its own concerns. "He is still in love with Margaret," Alice said. "He keeps her portrait on the mantel." "People who are still in love with the dead," Clara said gently, "keep the portrait in the bedroom where they sleep. The mantel is where you put someone you honor and remember but have made some peace with losing." Alice looked at the mantel, at the small oval frame, at Margaret's silhouette composed and still. "He has not given any indication," Alice said. "He has given every indication," Clara said, "to anyone who has eyes and is not specifically choosing not to see it." Alice looked back at her coffee. She felt the warmth of it in her hands and the particular quality of morning light in this cabin, and the specific feeling of being in a place that had begun to feel like somewhere she belonged, which was a feeling she had not experienced in a place that was not her own family home since she was a child. "I am from St. Louis," she said. "I have a school. I have a life." "You have a school where they will find another teacher," Clara said. "You have a rented room in a boarding house. You have parents who are healthy and not in need of you. You have a life you constructed carefully to avoid exactly the kind of disruption that is currently sitting in front of you on a mountain." Clara reached across the table and put her hand over Alice's. "He is a good man, Alice. He is a rare kind of good man. The kind who does the right thing when it is inconvenient and hard and there is no one watching and no reward for it. You know how rare that is." Alice did know. She knew it with the particular clarity of someone who had spent the past week watching that quality in action, documented and evidenced across 8 years of work that had been done in solitude for its own sake. "He has to actually say something," Alice said, "or I have to say something, and I am not going to say it." "Why not?" Clara asked. Alice opened her mouth and then closed it because the honest answer was complex. The honest answer was that she was afraid. Not of rejection, exactly, or not only of rejection. Afraid of what came after a yes. Afraid of the kind of commitment that a yes in a place like this implied, which was a larger and more permanent commitment than the kind you made in St. Louis, where things could be managed and adjusted, and there were structures and familiarity to fall back on. A yes here meant a life here, on a ridge in New Mexico territory, where the summer burned and the winter was serious and the work was constant, and the world was wilder than anything she had known. She was afraid of wanting it too much. Wesley came back from the valley in the early afternoon, bringing provisions from Barlow's store and a letter from the Santa Fe lawyer that contained good news about the deed challenge. And he came through the door with his hat pushed back and dust on his jacket, and his gray eyes moving immediately to where Alice sat at the table, and settling there with an ease that he did not seem to notice he was doing. And she felt the exact thing that Clara had described as lighting up, and she thought, "Clara is right, and I am tired of pretending otherwise." She did not say anything that afternoon. But that evening, after Clara had retired to the back room, while Alice and Wesley sat at the table with the lamp between them, and she was finishing a letter to the Santa Fe lawyer and he was annotating one of his maps, she put down her pen and looked at him directly and said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly, even if the honest answer is awkward." He put down his pencil and gave her his full attention. "All right," he said. "Do you want me to leave the ridge?" He looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said. "Why not?" Another long moment. "Because the ridge has been very quiet for a long time," he said. "You have filled it in a way I did not know it needed to be filled. And because when I ride back up here in the afternoon, knowing you are here, something in me settles that has not settled in a very long time." Alice held his gaze. "I am from St. Louis," she said. "I am not a frontier woman. I do not know how to do most of what you do here." "You learned the garden in 3 days," he said. "You handled a crisis in an abandoned hacienda with steadiness that most men I know would not have matched. You organized 8 years of my documentation in an afternoon in a way that made it considerably more useful than it was when it was mine. And you have opinions about George Eliot that I find myself thinking about when you are not in the room." She felt warmth rise in her face. "That is not the basis for a serious decision." "It is part of one," he said. A serious decision has many parts. What are the other parts? The other parts, he said carefully, include the fact that I have not felt like a complete person since 1879, and I have been managing that by keeping myself occupied, which has worked sufficiently until approximately 10 days ago. And the fact that the woman across this table from me has more courage and more mind and more heart than anyone I have met in 8 years. And I am aware that the honest thing to do about that is to say so rather than wait and lose the opportunity. He paused. And the fact that I am 31 years old and not so proud that I cannot admit when something matters to me. The lamp between them was very warm. The pine outside was very dark. Alice felt the decision she had been afraid of making clarify itself into something simple and clean, the way decisions sometimes do when the fear falls away and leaves only the actual choice. I have never lived anywhere this high above sea level, she said. My ears are still adjusting. They will, he said. Give it another week. A week, she said. Is that your offer, a week? He looked at her across the lamp with those storm-gray eyes and said very quietly, My offer is considerably longer than a week, Miss Hale, but I thought I would start there. She smiled. It was not the performance of a smile, but the real thing, involuntary and wide. And she saw something happen in his face in response to it that was the same kind of involuntary and real. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and he turned his hand over so that his palm met hers, and they sat like that in the lamplight with the pine forest breathing outside and the valley far below, and the stars coming out over the ridge in a density that was nothing like anything visible from the gaslit streets of St. Louis. Clara left for her homestead with Douglas 3 days later, and Alice watched her go from the ridge with a feeling that was complex. Love for her sister, relief that she was safe, gratitude for what Clara had said at the breakfast table, and the particular mixture of grief and joy that comes with watching someone you love return to their own life. Then it was just the ridge and the cabin and Wesley and Alice and the work. There was still a great deal of work. The legal situation was far from resolved and needed attention. There were letters to write and records to compile and trips to make to Alamosa Junction for telegraph communications, and to Cutter's Creek for meetings with Marshal Flores's deputies. There was the garden, which needed daily attention as summer deepened. There was the barn and the horses and the chickens and the pump and the 1,000 other small requirements of a working homestead in the high desert. Alice did all of it. Not because she was told to, and not out of any sense of obligation, but because she genuinely needed to be useful, and because each task taught her something she had not known before, and she was constitutionally incapable of not wanting to learn things. Wesley taught her to ride properly, not the cautious, correct style she had learned in St. Louis, but the practical, economical Western style suited to long distances over uneven terrain. He showed her how the saddle needed to be balanced, and how to read the horse's communication through the reins, and how to sit a fast gallop on rough ground without bracing rigidly, which was counterproductive, but by flowing with the movement, which felt terrifying until it felt natural. She fell twice on the gray gelding's back during those lessons, once rather hard, and both times Wesley was beside her immediately, his hand steady and his voice calm, and both times she got back on the horse, which she did partly because it was the right thing to do, and partly because she was not going to be the sort of person who stayed on the ground when she could be back in the saddle. He taught her to identify the geological features of the terrain, reading the landscape like a text, and she found that she loved this, that the valley below them had a history written in stone that went back millions of years, and that once you knew how to read it, the land became something entirely different, not background but document, not scenery but record. She taught him things too. She read to him from books on his own shelves that he had read alone and never been able to discuss, and the discussions that came from those readings were among the richest conversations she had ever had. She showed him a method she used in the classroom for organizing complicated information, spatially, that he adapted for his documentary work, and found significantly more efficient than what he had been doing. She wrote letters to his parents in Virginia, whom he had been corresponding with in a desultory way, and rewrote the letters in a way that conveyed warmth and substance without losing his voice, and he read the revised versions and said, very quietly, that he had not realized how much he had been keeping them at arm's length, and that he did not want to continue doing that. The summer moved through its heat and into the gentler warmth of early September. The legal proceedings continued. Dunn's attorney fought the charges with considerable skill, but the evidence was too complete and too well documented, and by mid-September it was clear that the outcome was not in doubt, only the specific consequences and timeline. Alice wrote to the school in St. Louis. She wrote to her parents. She explained that she was staying in New Mexico territory, that she was well and safe, and that she had met someone. Her mother wrote back within 3 weeks, which was very fast for the mail, and her mother's letter contained, beneath the practical questions and maternal concerns, a kind of joy that Alice recognized as her mother wanting exactly this for her, and being surprised to have it actually happen. One evening in September, at the end of a day that had been productive and calm and ordinary in all the good ways, Wesley came to where Alice was sitting on the porch in one of the 2 chairs, and stood for a moment looking at the valley below in the last light. And then he said, without preamble, in the direct way that was entirely his own, "I want to marry you, Alice. I want you to know that with complete clarity. I am asking, not presuming. If the answer is no, I will respect it and my regard for you will not diminish by a particle. But the answer to the question of what I want is that I want to spend the rest of my life on this ridge and I want you to be in it." She had been waiting for him to say it, and she had not known she was waiting until he said it, and the waiting resolved into something warm and settled and clear. "Yes," she said. "That is my answer." "It is yes." He sat in the other chair and took her hand, and they sat in the September evening watching the valley turn gold and then purple and then dark, and neither of them said anything further for a long time, and neither of them needed to. They were married in October. The ceremony was held in the Cutter's Creek Church and was performed by the minister, a gentle man named Reverend Alcott, who had welcomed Alice warmly when she first arrived and had been more forthcoming than most of the town's residents. And the guests included Clara and Douglas Holt, Pete from the livery, Randall Barlow, who seemed genuinely delighted in the way that people who feel guilty about past behavior can be when given an opportunity to celebrate something unambiguously good. Marshall Flores, who had finished the bulk of his work in the valley and was leaving for Santa Fe the following week, and Thomas, the Jicarilla Apache man who had spoken to Alice on her second day in the valley, and who appeared at the church door in clean clothes, and with a gift of woven cloth that was among the most beautiful things Alice had ever received. Wesley wore his best coat, which was not a suit coat but a good wool jacket, and he had shaved and cut his hair and stood at the front of the church with his hands clasped in front of him, and watched Alice walk toward him with the expression of a man who has survived something he was not sure he would survive, and has found that on the other side of it is something he had not dared to expect. Alice wore a dress she had bought in Albuquerque on a trip with Clara the previous week, a good cream wool that was not a true wedding dress, but was close enough for the territory in 1882, and she carried dried wildflowers that she had gathered from the ridge and dried herself, because flowers in October in New Mexico at altitude were not plentiful but were interesting if you knew where to look, and she was learning to know where to look. She walked toward him and he watched her come, and when she reached him and he took her hand, she felt the ring he had brought out from a small box in his jacket pocket, a plain gold band that had been his mother's, and that his mother had sent west with a letter saying she was too old to make the journey herself, but that she was glad her son had found someone, and please write more. The autumn settled into the ridge with its specific quality of clear cold air and brilliant low light, and the smell of pine resin intensifying with the temperature drop. Alice loved autumn on the ridge with an immediacy that surprised her, coming from a city where autumn meant the beginning of cold and the closing in of gray skies. Because autumn on the ridge was luminous. The sky so deeply blue it seemed structural. The mountains going from green to a dozen colors of copper and rust and amber as the aspens changed. The evenings becoming long and deeply comfortable with the fire going, and the lamps lit, and the smell of whatever Wesley was cooking filling the cabin. They were happy in the ordinary, detailed, daily way that is the actual substance of a life shared. This is the part that is difficult to describe in ways that carry the weight it deserves, because the moments that make a life are not always the dramatic ones. Sometimes it is the morning when she sees him at the water pump with his hair wet and his eyes still half asleep, and he says good morning and the good morning lands somewhere in the middle of her chest and stays there all day. Sometimes it is the evening when they are both reading and he puts down his book to tell her something about what he just read, not because it is important, but because he thought she would find it interesting, and she does find it interesting, and that exchange of interest is the whole world for a moment. Sometimes it is the ride down from the ridge on a cold morning with the valley spread below them and the sun just cresting the eastern mountains, and she looks at him on the gray gelding, and he looks at her, and they do not say anything because the moment contains more than words are suited for. The legal resolutions came gradually through the winter. Carver Dunn was convicted in January of 1883 on charges that included fraud, extortion, and conspiracy, and was sentenced to 8 years in the territorial prison in Santa Fe. Aldous Crane pleaded to lesser charges and was removed from his position. Hollis Prout lost his banking license and left the territory. The Land Commission underwent a full audit, and several of its members faced civil charges. The silver vein remained in the earth for several more years before a legitimate mining operation was eventually established through a process that, while imperfect, included some compensation for the affected landowners that was better than nothing. Wesley documented the entire proceedings with his characteristic thoroughness and submitted copies of everything to the territorial archives, the newspaper, and the lawyer in Santa Fe, because his view was that the record mattered whether or not justice was fully served. The Ray's family returned to their land in February of 1883. Wesley rode down with Alice to welcome them back, and the reunion between Emilio Ray's widow, a woman named Maria, and the land she had been separated from for nearly a year was one of the most quietly moving things Alice had ever witnessed. Maria Ray's was a practical woman who did not spend long on sentiment, but she touched the adobe wall of her family's house with her palm flat against it and closed her eyes for a moment, and Alice found she had to look away for a minute because her own eyes were embarrassing her. Spring came to the ridge in a way that Alice had never experienced spring before. Instant. Louis, spring was a gradual social emergence, people coming out of doors, flowers appearing in managed gardens, the city remembering itself after winter. On the ridge, spring was a geological event. The snowmelt came first, turning every small drainage into a running creek and filling the air with the sound of water, which after the silence of winter seemed almost extravagant. Then the wildflowers, coming up through the still cold ground with a determination that felt personal, as if each flower had been waiting for exactly this moment and was not going to miss it. In March, Alice realized she was pregnant. She had suspected it for 2 weeks before she was certain, and she told Wesley on a morning when the first wildflowers were showing themselves at the edge of the clearing, small yellow things she had learned were called golden eye. He went very still when she told him. Then he came to where she was standing and put his hands on her shoulders and looked at her with an expression that was made of things she could not entirely name, joy and something that was almost reverence and something that was grief processed through joy, the memory of Margaret and the loss of what they never had together transformed into gratitude for what was being offered now. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am happy. Are you?" "Yes," he said. "I am very happy." He kissed her forehead and then her mouth and then pulled her into his arms and held her in the spring morning with the smell of snowmelt and pine around them and the wildflowers opening at the edge of the clearing, and she let herself be held. Clara came up to the ridge when she heard, with a basket of food and a shawl she had been knitting since January that she presented with the air of someone who had been waiting for this excuse. Douglas Holt had turned out to be, under the right circumstances, a decent man, and his and Clara's marriage had found its footing again after the upheaval of that summer, and they had their own news, which was that Clara was also expecting, in June, which meant she had known for a month already and had been very elaborately pretending not to be preoccupied with it. The two sisters sat on the porch in the April warmth and talked for hours while Wesley and Douglas, engaged in the careful male bonding of two men who have no particular basis for friendship, but share a common circumstance, and are willing to make the effort, which in this case took the form of discussing the water rights situation in the southern part of the valley, which was genuinely interesting if you understood the terrain, and both of them did. Alice's son was born in September of 1883, 1 year and a month after she had ridden up the Ridge Road for the first time. He was born in the cabin with the assistance of Dr. Faraday, who had made the ride up from Cutter's Creek with his bag in his steady hands, and of Clara, who had given birth to her own daughter in June and now considered herself an experienced authority, which was not entirely accurate but was helpful in its confidence. They named the boy James. James Matthew Mercer, Matthew for Wesley's father in Virginia, and Wesley wrote his parents a letter that went 6 pages, which was unprecedented in their correspondence, and his mother wrote back a letter of 4 pages that Alice read twice, and then kept in the box where she kept her most important correspondence. James was a serious-faced, wide-eyed baby who looked from the beginning like his father except for his eyes, which were Alice's dark brown rather than Wesley's gray, and who had an early opinion about everything, and was not shy about communicating it in the limited vocabulary available to him. Wesley held his son with the careful intensity of a man who has been given something he did not dare to want and is still half convinced that wanting it too openly might invite it to be taken away. Alice watched him with the baby in the evenings, sitting in the chair by the fire with James against his chest, and she thought about the portrait on the mantel and about Margaret and about the absence that had shaped this man for 4 years before she arrived, and she felt not jealousy but something more like tenderness toward all of it, toward the whole complicated human story of him. The grief and the patience and the 8 years of solitary work, and the way he had opened his door to her on a July morning and given her coffee and the truth, and changed both of their lives. She got up from where she was sitting and went to the chair and sat on the arm of it, and he shifted James to one arm and put the other around her, and the 3 of them were in the firelight together, and the ridge was very quiet outside, and the valley was far below, and the stars above the territory were doing what they always did, which was being extraordinary without making any fuss about it. The years on the ridge were good years. They were not without difficulty, which is to say they were real years, the kind where the winter is harder than you expected and the summer brings drought, and a horse goes lame at an inconvenient time, and the legal correspondence requires more work than anticipated, and the nearest doctor is 4 miles away on a day when 4 miles feels very long. But the difficulty was shared, and difficulty shared between 2 people who are genuinely suited to each other has a different quality than difficulty borne alone. James grew with the specific vitality of a child raised in high altitude and open air, walking early and talking early and developing very strong opinions about the gray gelding, whom he considered his personal property from about age 2. Wesley taught him geology as soon as he could hold a rock, which was immediately, and Alice taught him letters as soon as he would sit still long enough to look at them, which took slightly longer. He was a child who wanted to understand how everything worked, which they both took as a compliment and an obligation. In 1885, when James was almost 2, they had a second child, a daughter they named Eleanor Margaret, the Margaret for the woman on the mantel. And Alice had suggested this, and Wesley had looked at her when she suggested it with an expression that she could not fully describe, but that settled something in him that she had watched him carry for years. And he had said, simply and fully, "Thank you." Eleanor was different from James in every way possible except the intensity of her interest in the world, which was identical. She had Wesley's gray eyes and Alice's laugh, and a stubbornness that appeared to be an original contribution from Eleanor herself. She slept badly as an infant, and made up for it with energy during the waking hours that was exhausting and delightful in equal measure. Clara and Douglas visited regularly, and their daughter Ruth and James developed the particular friendship of close-in-age cousins who spend enough time together to form a genuine bond, one that involves considerable negotiation and the occasional dramatic disagreement, but is fundamentally warm and durable. Wesley's parents came west in 1886. His father was 70 and in declining health, and the journey was significant for both of them. But his mother insisted, and she was right to insist, because the weeks they spent on the ridge were clearly some of the most important of his father's late years. Wesley's father, whose name was also James, could still talk geology with his son for hours in the way that people who share a deep expertise can, and Alice watched those conversations with the specific pleasure of seeing someone she loved in the context of where he came from and understanding more of him through it. His father died the following winter in Virginia, and Wesley received the news by mail in February and took his horse out alone for several hours and came back quiet and sat by the fire, and Alice sat with him and did not try to fill the silence with words, because she had learned, over 4 years of living with him, that some things were best held in silence, and that presence was its own form of speech. The ridge was different after the legal proceedings concluded. Not dramatically different, but changed in small ways. People in Cutter's Creek who had been keeping the complicated silence of guilty knowledge gradually became more ordinary in their dealings with Wesley. The reflexive glance toward the ridge when his name was mentioned, which had been made of anxiety and concealment, became something else over time, something more like respect or even pride, the way a community will sometimes retroactively claim as their own the person who acted with courage when they themselves did not. New families came to the valley as the territorial period progressed, and some of them heard the story and sought Wesley out specifically. People who had land disputes or questions about rights, or who simply wanted the advice of a man who was known to understand both the law and the landscape. He helped where he could and said honestly when he could not, and he never charged anything for the help, which Alice occasionally argued about and never won. There was a school established in Cutter's Creek in 1884, and Alice contributed to its curriculum design and taught there on alternate weeks through the first 2 years, riding down the ridge road in the morning and back in the afternoon, a ride she had mastered so thoroughly by then that she did it in all weather without concern. She stepped back from the regular teaching when Eleanor arrived, but she remained connected to the school in a consulting capacity and wrote a small handbook on teaching methods that circulated among the schools of the territory and eventually went further, which she found embarrassing and which Wesley found exactly as impressive as it was. Thomas, the Jicarilla Apache man who had spoken to Alice on her second day in the valley and attended their wedding, became in the years following something between a friend and a trusted associate, a relationship built on mutual respect and practical cooperation in the ongoing and complicated matter of land documentation for Apache families in the area. The outcomes for those families remained imperfect under a legal system structurally designed to exclude them, and Wesley and Alice both understood and were honest about those limits, but the relationships built in that effort mattered in their own right. The territory became the state of New Mexico in 1912, long after most of this story. And by then the valley and the ridge were both changed and unchanged in the way that places are after 30 years. The outlines the same, but the details layered and accumulated. New buildings and new roads and new families, and the old families deeper in their roots. But in the years that are the heart of this story, the years between the summer of 1882 and the arrival of a new century, the ridge was what it was. A high, pine-scented piece of earth above a valley that had secrets and has told them, above a town that had been afraid and has found something better than fear, the home of a man who had been alone for too long and a woman who had ridden up a mountain to ask a question and received an answer that changed everything. The portrait of Margaret stayed on the mantel. Alice had never asked him to move it and never would. Eleanor, when she was old enough to ask, was told about Margaret with honesty and gentleness, and she grew up understanding that love is not a fixed quantity that diminishes when shared but an expanding thing, capable of containing both a remembered life and a fully lived present without one diminishing the other. James, at 7, fell deeply in love with geology in the way that children fall in love with things when their parents love them too. And he spent 2 summers systematically collecting rock samples from the ridge and labeling them in a notebook in handwriting that tried very hard to be as small and precise as his father's, and was getting there. Wesley built him a display case for the collection, a proper one with glass and wooden dividers, and the display case eventually held 87 specimens, each labeled, each with a note about where it was found and what it meant. Eleanor, at 5, discovered that she could get the gray gelding, who was getting old by then, to follow her around the paddock by offering him pieces of carrot, and she spent considerable time testing the limits of this arrangement. Wesley watched her from the fence with his arms folded, and an expression that was doing its best to be stern and not quite managing it. Alice watched him watch Eleanor, and felt the particular happiness of watching someone you love be completely themselves, in a moment that is ordinary and precious and gone as soon as it is there. On an evening in the late summer of 1888, they sat on the porch, the 2 of them, after the children were asleep inside, and the ridge was dark around them, and the valley below was a collection of distant lights that had increased in number over the years as more families settled and the town grew. James was old enough now that his bedroom window was sometimes lit late with the small lamp he was allowed to keep for reading, and they could see the faint glow of it from the porch, the light of their son reading himself to sleep, which was a thing that made both of them quietly content in a way that had no adequate words. "Do you ever regret it?" Wesley asked. She looked at him. "Regret what specifically?" "Coming up the ridge. Staying. All of it." He said it without anxiety, as a genuine question, the kind you can only ask someone you trust completely. "No," she said. "Do you?" "Letting so much time pass before you arrived," he said. "Yes, I regret that occasionally. The 8 years I spent up here alone, when I could have been doing what we have done together, I could have done it better and faster with someone beside me." He looked at the valley. "But I understand that the path had to go where it went, and it went here." "It went here," she agreed. She put her hand in his on the arm of the chair. He turned his palm up and held it. The valley below them was full of light, and the ridge above them was full of stars, and the pines moved in the late summer wind, with the sound they had always made and would make long after both of them were gone. And the cabin behind them held their sleeping children and their shared life, and the surveyor's table with its documented truths, and the mantel with its honored memory, and the bookshelves with their worn and consulted volumes, and the cook-stove that was always warm. It was enough. It was, Alice thought, in the specific and exact way that genuine satisfaction works, exactly enough. Not because there were no more difficulties ahead, because there would be, because that is the nature of living. Not because every injustice had been resolved, because it had not, and would not be for a very long time, and they both knew that and would continue to work within that knowledge. But because the 2 of them together on this ridge had become something that was larger than either of them alone, And that thing they had become was stable and real and capable of doing good in the world. And it had started from a question asked in a valley, from a look toward a ridge, from a woman who was too stubborn to accept silence as an answer riding up a mountain in the July dawn to find the truth. She had found considerably more than the truth. The years settled around them like something patient and good, and the ridge held them, and the valley turned below through its seasons, and every question that had brought Alice Hale to this place had been answered, not with a glance and a silence, but with a life, full and chosen and deeply, irreversibly hers.